Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it's your buddy Derek Pascarella here, otherwise known as A-Team, and today we're going to be taking a look at an often misunderstood, misrepresented home game console, if you'd like to call it that, from Fujitsu, called the FM Towns Marty. What is the FM Towns Marty? Well, it's basically a home consoleized version of their popular computer from back in the day. It sometimes gets misunderstood as trying to compete in the 5th gen along the likes of the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, etc. But really it's something else altogether. And in this video we're going to dive into a very, very tiny amount of history, but also just showing off all of the ways, the cool ways, this machine can be used in 2025. So, for a tiny bit of history here, the FM Towns Marty was first released, the Model 1, on February 20th of 1993, and the Model 1 is what we see here. The Model 2 I've got also, probably won't be in this video though, because I don't feel like going to disconnect it from the insane spaghetti wire mess that is my living room, but it is more or less identical. It's got a different outer shell. It's like a dark gray with yellow buttons for a little two-tone action, but it's got the same specs otherwise. Now, the FM Towns Marty came with an AMD 386 SX CPU running at 16 megahertz, so kind of on par with the earlier home desktop models. Interestingly though, it uses fast mode by default, otherwise it'd be about 20% slower than the 386DX used by the Towns. And really, fast mode just allows it to, run software on par with the earlier desktop models. And that works kind of by just cutting down wait cycles on the CPU. Now, in terms of things like video output, sadly, there is no RGB on this beautiful machine. Instead, you're relegated to composite or S-video, which normally wouldn't be so bad, except for, man, S-video on the Marty is a smudgy, Vaseline, disgusting mess. And I know some people have been tinkering around trying to figure out ways to maybe get digital video out of this thing, and that'd be a very welcome mod one day in the future, because presently video just looks awful. Even well, that's my opinion at least, even when using something like the RetroTink 4K or going directly into a CRT. Let's talk a little bit about storage mediums and things like that. So, just like the FM Towns desktop machines, the Marty supports both floppy disk drives as well as CD-ROMs. And in fact, if I don't have my history incorrect here, the FM Towns was actually the first CD-ROM capable out-of-the-box home computer, which I think was followed a year or two or three later by the Commodore CD-TV. But as far as I know, the FM Towns has got that claim to fame. And we're going to be looking at a few things later on in this video, things like floppy disk emulator. You can see I've got a little USB stick here, as well as things like an optical drive emulator. But for now, let's stick with some basics. So why don't we first start by looking at input peripherals, things like keyboards, mice, controllers. Now, just like the desktop computers, the FM Towns Marty can accept FM Towns keyboards or things like this specially branded FM Towns Marty keyboard. Our connector here would plug directly into the side, and we would have full keyboard use, which would be supported for games or even running Towns OS. Now, what is Towns OS? Well, unlike other game consoles, because the FM Towns Marty is really a consoleized version of a desktop computer, it is designed to run basically a customized version of MS-DOS called Towns OS. And Towns OS, like I said, basically an MS-DOS clone in a sense, but with a far lap extender. There's no hard drive on the FM Towns Marty. So basically, all games, whether on floppy or on CD or some combination of both, would have Towns OS and all necessary libraries baked in and bundled in. But that also means you can actually run a Towns OS disk, use your mouse and keyboard, and actually have a full desktop computer-like experience. So outside of the keyboard, we've also got, of course, as you'd expect, a mouse. And in the case of the FM Towns Marty, the mouse actually goes directly into the controller input ports in the front. And you've also got a number of controller options. The default controller that came with the Marty is this tiny little baby controller of a thing with pretty horrible D-pad, A and B buttons, you know, similar to other retro Japanese computers, a run and select button, and then also a little trigger button here that is supposed to be capable of switching resolutions in games that support it. Although I will say I've yet to encounter a game where pressing this button at any point does anything at all, but that's okay. And in addition to the specially branded Marty controller, the standard 2-button FM Towns pad meant for the desktop computers, of course, is also compatible. Same type of connector as we see. And that also means stuff like this pretty, I don't want to say exceedingly rare, but expensive, not so easy to come by 6-button controller for the desktop machines is also compatible. And of course, this will make things like playing, fighting games and such a little bit more manageable. Now, one thing that's really cool in terms of, using this machine in the modern day is that you've got different options for things like controllers, keyboards, and mice. So in terms of controllers, my good friend OMP Retro released last year something called the FM 2 and 6 controller, aptly named because it's designed for the FM Towns Marty, and through this very satisfying clickable toggle button, can switch between 2-button and 6-button mode. Really, really awesome. And in fact, this controller is also compatible to some degree with most other retro Japanese PCs, things like the X68000, etc. Although with some limitations for some titles on those other machines. But for the FM Towns Marty or the FM Towns, this is my favorite, absolute, most preferred controller to use. He used aftermarket Sega Saturn shells that feel excellent. The D-pad is great. I mean, it's just, goes without saying. The Sega Saturn pad is one of the greatest gaming achievements of mankind. So, excellent controller. But in addition to that, you've also got some pretty interesting peripherals like this Capcom CPA-001 adapter. This plugs directly into a Towns or Towns Marty and then lets you plug in a Mega Drive controller. And I believe there's other controllers supported as well, but a Mega Drive controller so you can actually use a wired Mega Drive pad on your Marty. And why do I have this thing? Well, I have this thing because I went on the insane venture of trying to find a wireless controller option for the Marty for when I'm in my living room and I'm way too far away from the unit itself. And it turns out that using this Capcom adapter coupled with the 2.4 gigahertz Crix wireless Mega Drive pad is the only way I have found to actually reliably deliver a wireless controller experience. No other wireless Mega Drive or Genesis controller has worked for me. Not the 8BitDo retro receiver coupled with something like the Nintendo Switch Online Mega Drive controller. Not the RetroBit 2.4 gigahertz wireless controller, but only the Crix version. Warning, if you were to try to, endeavor to go for a wireless controller on your Marty or your Towns, this adapter is at least $200, $300 on eBay. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit I've got, I think, 4 of these, because I also use it on the X68000. Maybe I really should let some of these go. But yeah, there's an option for wireless controllers. And you've also got, from Japan, they can be found through various websites, these really cool USB adapters for keyboard and mouse. So this goes directly into the controller port, and we can actually use a wireless or wired USB mouse this way. So I actually do this when I'm using the Marty here in my office because it sits so far away from my desk, but this solution works beautifully. On top of that, we've got the same thing for a keyboard, and you can see the keyboard plugs into the side of the console. But for the keyboard, since I don't really do a whole lot of full typing and rarely actually need use of a keyboard, well, I've just got one of these guys. Cheap little USB wireless keyboard, and it does the job beautifully for, you know, the very little bit of keyboard navigation one would actually need on the FM Towns Marty. And that's the gist of various input peripheral options. You know, keyboard, mouse, controllers, wireless, aftermarket, adapters, you name it. As you can see, there's, you know, some pretty cool stuff available for the Towns and the Towns Marty. So why don't we take another look at, you know, the console itself and check out things like, you know, floppy drive emulator, CD-ROM drive, optical drive emulator, and kind of discuss what our options are there today. All right, we are back up close and personal, and let's dive a little bit into some of the other peripherals, mods, add-ons, and things for the console because, you know, no silly Derek video would be complete without them. So first of all, one of the limitations of the FM Towns Marty, aside from being stuck on a 386 CPU and thus having certain games play far too slowly to be enjoyable, is also a 2 megabyte RAM limitation. But you can see back here, there's actually an expansion slot in the back of the Marty, something that I don't think was hardly ever used during the actual retail life cycle of this machine. I think there was a printer peripheral. I know very little about it, but Caius from Caius Arcade actually developed this 2 megabyte RAM expansion card. You can see here I have the later revision. I've got an older one too, but I've got the newer revision with the on-off toggle switch. The reason that's there is because some games actually misbehave when you up the RAM to 4 megabytes from 2. But having this here lets us play games like Street Fighter 2. It also enables some things like extra levels and some other features, I think, in a few other games like Puri La Lu. I always get the name wrong. Or maybe I'm thinking of the PCFX title. Either way, when we switch over to the TV and I show you the list of games, I'll call out the name of the game that I'm thinking of here that has some extra features. I want to say it's like Puri La Rura, or maybe that's PCFX. Anyway, something with a P. So we've got that cool add-on. It's readily available, can be purchased from Caius either directly on eBay or through his other online store. And now, you heard me mention before, floppy drive and CD-ROM drive. Well, FM Towns and Towns Marty games are kind of unique in that since it's a computer, right, games can come maybe on a floppy disk, maybe on a CD-ROM, or some combination of both, which is actually quite common. And what do I mean by a combination? Well, oftentimes, either as a protection mechanism or just as sort of a, you know, a standard operating procedure, they had this concept of needing the user to insert a floppy disk, often called a boot disk or a user disk, in conjunction with the CD-ROM. And the CD-ROM in and of itself would not be sufficient to boot the software or the game. So the user disk would be required, maybe even a special save disk, and then the CD-ROM. And then there's still other games that require no floppy at all, unless you want to save your progress. So on this unit and my other Marty 2 unit out in the living room, not pictured here, I've got a floppy disk drive emulator. And you can see I've actually got a little USB thumb drive inserted where normally the eject button would be. And this is actually called The Thing, from the same gentleman who gave us the RAM expansion card, Caius. The Thing. And if I open my CD-ROM lid here, we can actually see that inside the console is the floppy drive emulator, and then running up to this opening here is actually a dial and an OLED display that lets us cycle through and mount floppy disk images. And behind it, I've got the DocBrown, aptly named for the Marty, optical drive emulator. And because there's no very pretty 3D mounted print for this that exposes the SD card in a way I'd like, what I've simply done is just puttied down this extender, SD card extender, to fit on the SD card as it goes into the slot, and then I can easily remove and add games just like that. Now there is something of a 3D printed mount. It looks like this. I used to have it installed until I got the floppy emulator because it doesn't fit anymore, but even this really still doesn't do a whole lot. You're still required to remove and insert the SD card, and it's quite fragile, so I opted for this extender method. Now, as I said, the floppy emulator called The Thing is readily available. The optical drive emulator called DocBrown, not so much. It's made by Dunin out in Poland, the same guy responsible for the Wizard ODE, which is similar to the DocBrown except for the desktop and tower FM Towns models. And he's also the creator of the Rhea and Phoebe optical drive emulators for the Sega Saturn, as well as probably his most popular device, the GDEMU for the Sega Dreamcast. So this is what we've got. In the future, Fixel's DMC-88, another great name playing off the Marty title, will be released, which will be an all-in-one unit actually. It'll be an optical drive emulator and floppy drive emulator all in one, but that has not hit the market yet. So these days, unfortunately, because the DocBrown is pretty much not even sold anymore or hasn't been for a while, your only options are finding one secondhand, or of course, burning your own discs. That's always, always an option. But unfortunately, with these old Marty units, rarely can you find a used one where both the floppy drive and the CD-ROM drive are in good working order. All right, so let's power on the console. And if we open up our lid here, we can see the rotary dial and the OLED asking us to select a disk image. Let's go check out what we see on the TV. All right, so here we are with the FM Towns Marty booted up with the DocBrown optical drive emulator going with our list of games. Now, those who have previous experience with GDEMU or Rhea or Phoebe are familiar with the way Dunin likes to kind of architect his drive emulators. You have a series of numbered folders, and then oftentimes in folder number 1 or 01 rather, you will have the actual menu software. And that's what we see up on our screen today. And of course, this had to get a cool name too, and it's called Almanac. The Back to the Future references never stop. Now, I actually wrote a little piece of software that helps you easily manage your FM Towns Marty SD card. It lets you throw disk images directly into a folder on your SD card, giving the folder any name that you want for the game. Of course, just like his other devices, you can't use Cubin disk images, but CCD image sub, otherwise known as clone CD format, work just fine. And of course, those can easily be converted from something like redump disk images. I also created a little custom entry there, number 1, boot from floppy. And the way to achieve that was just to throw an empty folder in the first game slot. There's nothing in it. So when I try to launch it, no disk image is mounted, and thus the Marty kicks back to trying to boot from floppy. But if we scroll through the game list here, it's pretty self-explanatory. Just selecting our game, launching it, right? And there's also some options. So for example, if we were to hit B, let's see if I press the right button here. Of course, I didn't press the right button. That was A, and it's gone ahead and actually launched Image Fight. But that's all right. We can see an example of the game booting here, and it's going to be going through a load process. All right, yes. I'm aware of all the warnings. Ooh, quite loud. Okay, but here we see it's successfully booted up this disk image. We can go into our setup. Now, one of the interesting things about the FM Towns Marty is that because it has this bizarre transcoder that ends up outputting this S-video, you have these different display mode options, which when using, an actual FM Towns desktop machine, with RGB or something VGA-like, you're gonna get a nice crisp picture. On the Marty, switching through these resolution options gets you all sorts of weird things. So it's kind of on a per game basis, which looks best. We can see this high resolution mode is selected by default. If we use video mode, I know it's hard to tell in this video, but things start looking a little clearer. Maybe the aspect ratio is correct, but things are cut off a bit. Of course, we could adjust the image if we needed to. And those are the two options. Oh, and then we've got the low resolution. So low resolution sounds like it would be bad, but in fact, between 15 or 31 or even like 24 kilohertz, whatever option this might actually align to, right? I can't actually tell because the Marty is kind of abstracting all that away from me. Low resolution actually looks best, in my opinion, in most cases. So that's exactly how I'm going to leave the setting. So See what happens if I try to start a game here. I can't remember the last time I played Image Fight. Womp womp. Alright, let's go ahead and reset the console, which will actually take us right back to the DocBrown menu. Now, I want to show you what happens if we try to boot a game that is known to require a user disk. Remember I talked about those floppy disks that would often accompany a game and be required in order to actually boot the game up? Right. So you remember I've got that floppy drive emulator, but if you recall how I kind of showed the dial and the little OLED screen in there, I have to actually select a floppy drive, a floppy disk image stored on that little USB thumb drive so that it can actually mount it and use it. So what happens if I select something like Temptation? This is a graphic adventure game that me and some friends translated not that long ago. And it requires a user disk. So we'll go ahead and try to boot this. And we will just see the Marty kind of like BIOS splash screen here. So it can't do anything with just the CD-ROM. Let's go back over to the console and go ahead and mount the Temptation user disk. Okay, here we are. So we'll select Exit to Selector. And you can see the names of the disk images here. There's the Temptation user disk. I'll select it. Oh, you heard the music stop. If I look at the floppy drive activity LED, it's starting to work. And we can even hear the, the floppy drive sound emulation, which is a setting on this emulator. All right, back to the TV. Okay, we can see the disk is booting, and that's actually the result of a batch script on the floppy that actually boots the game. It'll take a moment here at the splash screen, and then it'll take us into Temptation, the riveting graphic adventure. And there we are. And there's our game. Okay, well, back over to the Marty. Why don't we flip the 2 MB RAM expansion card to on and check out a game that requires 4 MB of RAM, like Street Fighter 2. Well, first and foremost, because Street Fighter 2 is a 6-button compatible game, we are going to want to depress the button in the down position to enable 6-button mode, but not while we are in the Almanac menu, because it is not compatible with 6-button mode. So we'll go ahead and launch Super Street Fighter 2, the new challenger. Now, ordinarily, if you used a stock FM Towns Marty with only the 2 MB of onboard RAM, you'd be presented with an error message telling you that the game requires at least 4 MB of RAM to function. But with the Caius Arcade 2 MB RAM expansion card inserted and turned on, like I just did a moment ago, this game suddenly becomes compatible. Albeit, maybe a bit suboptimal due to the 386. And actually that message that just popped up mentioned the 4 megabyte version. Yes, yes, yes. Subject to copyright law. Don't play this outside of Japan. Sure, sure. And look at that. It's working. So, important note actually for this game. We want to go into setup. Oops. Switch over to 6-button mode. And we want to change roster to off, otherwise it's incredibly unplayably slow. We want to adjust the CRT mode as well. So I think low wide, yeah, I think that's the best setting that I found. We'll go all the way easy too, why not? Configuration, we want to set this to 6-button pad. Right, there's other options too, like that Capcom adapter. Right, you can see that listed there, but we'll do the 6-button pad. So in cases where you want to use 6-button mode, you just launch the game from the almanac menu and then, you know, press the button down to engage 6-button mode. Actually see the picture is a little cut off. So what I'm actually doing here in this setup is I'm running the Marty via S-Video to a RetroTink 5X to clean it up. And then I'm taking the HDMI output at 240p or 480i. I have both set up and converting that to component for the BVM here because straight 480i coming out of the Marty into this thing just looked awful. Let me pause. But because of that, because of the wonky video modes on this thing. Yeah, that should do it. Let's see a bit more of the screen. Because of the wonky video modes on this thing, I'm using the Tink and sometimes you have to adjust. Just testing out the different input buttons, making sure they're all responding like they should, and they are. So with the roster setting turned off, it's really not unplayably slow or anything. It's, you know, maybe a bit laggier than playing on a desktop machine, but, you know, really not that bad. Very nice. Oh, you tell him. All right, and just because I said I was going to do it, what was that game that I couldn't figure out the name for earlier? And I kept giving the PCFX name. Let's see. I just reset the console. I want to say it's Pulirula. Oh, let me load the profile back to the default. Fix that scaling and cropping. Where is it? Pulirula. Okay, that's the one. We'll go ahead and launch this. Now this is the one that if you have the 4 megabyte, if you have the the 2 megabyte add-on enabled, totaling 4 megabytes of RAM, there are some extra features. I believe it's like 2, maybe 3 extra levels, and I believe some additional like character animations or additional enemies that you encounter, things like that. Let's go ahead and skip that. Set this to easy. Display mode, you can see a theme here. They all have some type of display mode setting. We'll go with that low resolution one, as always. You can leave fast mode off, I guess. Actually, I've never experimented with that. Perhaps I should. Just skip this to get into some of the gameplay. Oh no, baddies. I'm rescuing all the animals. All right. Well, as much fun as it is to sit here and record myself playing this game, I think you've probably all caught the gist of this by now. Let me turn our speakers down and pause the game. But yeah, that is it, my friends. That is the long and short of the FM Towns Marty, at least as I understand it. I am not claiming to be an expert on this machine by any means, but, you know, I own a couple of them. I had them fully serviced, recapped. I've got DocBrowns and The Thing floppy drive emulators in both. And it's just so bizarre that I love it. I love the fact that batch scripts running off a floppy drive are launching games. I love that when I when I've done translation patches for this machine, I'm dealing with, you know, like x86 assembly and, you know, executable file. It's a fun little machine to work on. And honestly, the Marty was my introduction, my gateway drug, as it were, to the world of retro Japanese computers. That console form factor, but actually being a, you know, a home computer, something really fun about that. Plug it into a TV like we see here and having that game console-like experience versus what you might get with, you know, a tower model or similar. So yeah, near and dear to my heart. I know it catches a lot of flack, and I know a lot of people in the retro Japanese computer scene shit on it, but that's why I love it. It is a misunderstood, misrepresented, underdog, bastard of a machine that should probably not even exist, but alas, here we are, and it does. Something that I believe Fujitsu was kind of trying to cater towards a younger audience, you know, children. Hey, just take it home, plug it into the TV, it'll just work, keyboard, mouse, games, whatever you want. But anyway, here in 2025, there's still ways to get some enjoyment out of the FM Towns Marty. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for more.